Hello. Yeah, I've slightly renamed it, put Improving Prospects before the title, just to kind of make it a little bit less boring. But the kind of angle of this talk will be to try and summarise a little bit where protected cropping seems to be at the moment in terms of soil management, and then use our nursery as a kind of case study to look at some of the things that we're doing around soil management. Taking into account that protected cropping has tended to deviate a little bit from what outdoor growers perceive to be acceptable in organic systems. And one of the, sorry, am I moving this on? Oh, there we go. I came across this statement on the Cost Action website. I don't know who got kind of funded to come up with this little gem, but it's a kind of fairly obvious statement that we need to improve sustainability, production, productivity, and obviously organic systems require a healthy soil to do so, amongst other things, but the soil is the key. So there is a kind of dilemma in protected cropping where we're trying to promote soil life and fertility through rotation, green manures, compost use, sensitive cultivation and tillage. That's kind of like the basic, where everyone's coming from in organic soil management. And yet protected crops are given quite a lot of leeway in the way they interpret this. And there's a question as to why this might be. Now, a lot of these things are kind of obvious, but it helps to summarise and encapsulate the situation a little bit. Obviously, glasshouses, polytunnels under the overall heading of greenhouse can be seen to have a higher cost associated with the structure. If they're heated, there's a lot of energy, and they're a more intensive labour demand as well, because there's less options for mechanising the systems. The sort of produce that's produced in glasshouses is generally a much higher value, and therefore the risks are increased, and the demand on the soil from an extended season of the types of crop that are grown is much higher. However, there are some sort of bonuses of working under protection with the irrigation control, where there's some influence over the leaching of nutrients from the soil. There's some influence over the biological activity in the soil through being able to manage moisture levels and also mineralisation of nitrogen. Irrigation can be used to influence that to some degree. And we also find that where you already have an existing irrigation system, it's a very little effort to use liquid fertilisers or biological amendments to supplement your system. And so these are frequently used in protected cropping, mainly because it is so easy to do so. And also protected crops do have very specific pest and disease issues, partly because they're kind of like the spoiled kids of the vegetable world. They don't have the stresses of the climate that kind of create a more robust crop. And also the climate does allow pests to proliferate, diseases and fungal diseases, where perhaps the natural biodiversity isn't there to help control those. Certain solutions and or reprieves are given to protected cropping to allow for some of these things. There's an acceptance in the fact that an increased use of restricted products may have to be used to keep the system reasonably healthy, and pest disease products and fertilisers. A sanitary environment is often created to reduce infection. Michael spoke about solarisation and soil steaming, but also the actual prevention of infection coming in from outside in a protected cropping situation is much easier. Probiotics and biocontrol agents, over the last few decades, this area of technology has come on massively, and there are now lots of organisms that are available to introduce: insects, bacteria, granular viruses, and these have all helped particularly protected cropping growers enormously in organic situations where before certain things were just unimaginable. analysis and amendment. This is quite a specialist area, but obviously if you've got very high value crops, you can afford to analyse and pay the money, decide how you're going to create a soil that is a perfect medium for that particular crop. And biological analysis has come a long way as well. Also, monocropping is, although it's not encouraged, it's kind of accepted, particularly for larger growers. And this is very much a market-driven aspect of protected cropping. Recent standards that the Soil Association did a few years ago did a kind of a check of the protected cropping standards and made it very clear that monocropping was not encouraged, but they have accepted that providing that the grower can show that their system is reasonably robust, if they can do that, then monocropping will be accepted as a way of being able to grow veg for a larger sort of wholesale market. And then these last two, I would say that these first few are kind of somewhat dubious from an organic principles perspective, whereas the last two are much more embracing what organic growers are trying to achieve, grafting and breeding for resistance and yield, and the use of large quantities of compost, particularly suppressive compost if it can be achieved. I'll just go back a step. The issue perhaps with some of these is that we're not getting rotation into the system as much as we'd like to see with monocropping, and it doesn't leave a lot of space for green manures. So we do end up with things like compost and cultivation technique being this kind of stalwart aspects of protected cropping that have to be focused on. However, some of the work we've been doing at Hankham Organics, I'm hoping to challenge that perspective a little. So most of those solutions and reprieves that are given for protected cropping rely on standards which do allow some deviation from perhaps what the core principles are put across as being for organic farming, and also a bit of a disengagement from the natural environment, so that the surrounding area will often be considered as a source of infection as opposed to a source of biodiversity. That we have increased external inputs where the protected cropping environment is kind of sucking in resources from around itself. And a lot of the products which we need to use are very specialised, where they're products that have to be bought in from companies that are producing these products, or even making your own compost, as Mark has been talking about. It's a very specialised technique, and there are arguments to say that if you're not making very good compost, it's arguable whether it's actually beneficial or not to put it in to the glass house. So growers really who are relying on compost really need to get their compost making skills up to scratch. What this has tended to have led to is a kind of polarisation of the protected cropping fraternity, where it can pretty much be split into small and large, and there's some between, there's some that kind of float from one to the other and have aspects of both. But what you find is that small units tend to rarely use heat, whereas large ones almost always do use heat to extend the season. Obviously there's a situation there with energy, but if it can be used efficiently and you're extending the season and it's avoiding importing crops, then there's a good argument for using heat. Larger units tend to do almost exclusively monocropping. Perhaps they'll rotate two crops, cucumbers and tomatoes maybe, but more often than not they're really trying to just specialise in one crop. Whereas smaller units tend to do mixed cropping, and this is often because of the sort of market that they'll supply being a more localised market, requiring more variety of produce. There's a higher input-output or a lower input-output from this is arguable because obviously small systems, if you're on a mixed farm, you might have a massive source of manure and you might be throwing loads of cow manure into your system, which could be considered a higher input. And some larger systems perhaps have worked out how to be much more efficient with the products that they're putting in, and they may be reducing their inputs quite a lot. But in general, you can sort of see that the smaller units are tending to put less in and get a bit less out per square metre. However, larger systems do tend to have an increased risk of catastrophe. It's quite a big word, but it's kind of like if you've got a protected system and you're growing 18,000 cucumber plants and you get an infestation that you can't control and it wipes the whole lot out, that is a catastrophe. Whereas small systems, if you lose a few cucumber plants, you've still got your peppers and your aubergines and your tomatoes. And quite often you don't see the spread because of the mixed cropping situation. You don't get such a infestation, kind of proliferation of a wave of infestation through the crop. Smaller growers tend to not have access to the knowledge required or the resources to utilise specialist analysis of soil, biological analysis, whereas larger systems do make use of this to better effect. And often in the large systems, as I've already mentioned, the onus is on exceptional compost, or should be on exceptional compost. Whereas with smaller growers tend to have the option of using compost, but also there's other ways of fertility building, such as perhaps using undersowing of green manures, cow manure, and mixed cropping rotation. The larger systems will benefit from economies of scale, whereas the smaller systems are trying to usually add value to an existing product range. And the small systems might also be part of a wider farm system, which allows them to do this, whereas a larger system will be often part of an otherwise non-organic system. And this is quite an interesting part of the dilemma, because most large units that have become specialised in organic production are kind of as a sideline for them, where they're trying to make use of responding to the market demand. And we've noticed that in the last few years, a lot of glasshouses have actually shut down the organic part of their production or reduced it right down, a lot of the larger protected croppers, because the market demand has reduced. Whereas the smaller growers have tended to sort of continue as they have been, as best they can. And you often find the smaller growers trying to actually create the market for their produce because they're passionate about what they're doing. And so they're going out and trying to find customers, whereas the larger guys are just really responding to the market. And finally, the supermarket requirement for cosmetic quality for the larger growers tends to mean that there is a lot of waste. You could argue that as they're better at growing it, then per square metre they're still getting very good yields. But with the smaller growers, and you've got direct relationship with your customers, the demand for some kind of the cosmetic quality of the produce is less, and so you can make better use of what you're growing. So that's kind of like me summarising where I see the situation, to put things in a bit of perspective. And where we come in terms of Hankham Organics is that we're somewhere between a small and large producer, and we're trying to kind of get the best out of both. Whether we're doing that or not is arguable, but I'd just like to sort of let you know what we do for those of you who haven't come across us before. We've got 1.5 acres. It's actually a bit more than that, but some of it's used as propagation area and water storage and things. So there's 1.5 acres of unheated protected cropping and 2.5 acres of field. And this area is my responsibility to grow the crops on those areas for our 600 box scheme. All of those 600 boxes are delivered door to door. We deliver to 2 shops, and we do some additional wholesale. And interestingly, our system actually focuses on most of our production in the glasses during the hungry gap, when we can really capitalise and know that everything we're going to sell is going to get sold because people are desperate for fresh local produce. And so that has a massive influence on the way the system has gone, because we can produce a lot of good stuff in the field during the latter part of the summer and the autumn, and a lot of our other local growers are trying to throw stuff at us at very good value at that time of year. There's not much point in us trying to produce lots of stuff in a glasshouse. So we concentrate really on growing from the kind of pre-Christmas period round to around about June for our sort of major production period. Which gives us self-sufficiency with the boxes, with all the green leafy stuff during the winter, and it means that in the spring we're able to supply a wholesale market with a lot of hungry gap produce. And then the latter part of the summer we're growing your classic glasshouse veg, but we really cut down on the potential of that because we end up with too much stuff, a lot of labour drain and no market for it. And the local market is key to what we do. And it's also very labour-intensive work, but it's varied. We employ people who do both delivery driving, packing, growing, all the aspects of growing the crops all the way up to delivering them to the customers, administration. And most of those people are local, well, they're all local staff, and most of them are full-time employees, and we maybe take on 2 extra people during the summer as a sort of part-time or seasonal work. Which we feel is quite a sort of ethically sound way of employing people. 50% of what's in the veggie boxes over the year, in terms of the financial value of it, is grown by us. But then we also sell about 50% of what we produce wholesale. So we're kind of like net self-sufficient for the box scheme in terms of the financial value of the produce. In terms of the system, we have a on-site heated propagation. We grow mixed crops on a 10-year rotation, which I'll explain in a moment. It's like kind of 2 cycles of 5 years. We're reasonably low input. We use compost, seed and transplants as our main source of input, and then we use well under a tonne of fertiliser on an acre and a half. Which will be a mixture of different fertilisers depending on what analysis has shown we need, mainly for some augmentation of potassium levels and nitrogen levels. And we also use some kieserite as a source of magnesium because we have very high calcareous soils, and we need to often maintain a reasonable amount of magnesium going into the system. We also find the compost is very high in calcium. So that helps to maintain the cation balance in the soil there. And we have exceptionally low waste. Our exported plastic or unreusable waste compares to 2 domestic dwellings. We manage most of it through our own bins at home and perhaps about a skip of rubbish a year. This includes the pack shed waste as well. All the boxes are reused and recycled, and we have very minimal harvest waste, and we estimate that 99% of our marketable produce that comes out of the glasshouse reaches our customers' doors within a few days, ready for them to eat. So it's up to them then how much gets wasted. And this is, I'm not going to run through all of these, but we grow basically, this year we've grown 94 different varieties of crop, and that's the types of crop, and then the little bracketed number is the varieties within that crop. Just to give you an idea of where we're coming from in a mixed cropping sense. So I'm going to look at the rotation, our compost use, our green manure use in the glasshouse, and just give you some idea of where we're at with that. The rotation is a proactive design which has evolved over the years, which is missing in a lot of protected cropping situations, although I know a lot of smaller growers who have very robust and proactive rotations. I don't know so many larger growers that are practicing this. Obviously, this is avoiding a build-up of soil pathogens from the repeated planting of the same crop. All the normal things that you expect from a rotation. But we're also, using the building up of fertility and then the kind of allowing fertility to kind of subside a little. There's a way of growing different types of crops, and so our very demanding crops will go in for a period and then it will ease off, and the crops which don't need such high fertility will be in for a while before green manure comes in. And here is part 1 of the 10-year rotation, and I just really wanted to point out that the basis of our rotation is that the first year has a summer green manure of clover, and which is then followed the following summer by cucurbits, early cucurbits, which is then followed in the 3rd year by solanaceae. And the other mixed crops come around that. In the years 4 and 5, we're growing fairly fertility extensive crops. They're not hugely demanding, and they don't tend to get too stressed out if there's not as much fertility in the soil as some of the other crops. And then we come around a full cycle and back in with the clover again. And at the stage at which we put the clover, we will do analysis of the soil, and we will add our amendments if they're required to build up the soil through the green manure period, so that for the next 2 years the balance of nutrients in the soil are good for those hungry crops. And part 2 of the 5-year rotation is very similar. comes back into clover. It's just that overall it does kind of make a 10-year rotation. And so hopefully these will be available on the website if anybody wants to scrutinise them further. So Solanaceae is only coming back to the soil every 5 years. Cucurbit's only coming back to the same soil every 5 years.
So does that mean you're
Sorry?
amendments on every 5 years?
No, it doesn't. We do also put amendments on through the year, but the analysis is taken at this stage for what the situation might be after we've allowed the fertility to drop a little. And at the other stages, it will be more crop-based. Generally, we're just using compost, but if the analysis has shown that magnesium levels are getting low, what we found was that the magnesium has been very low when we first started. We've built it up, and as we've built up the magnesium levels again in the soil, that this is translated through the crops back into the compost, back into the soil again. And so it's kind of like a cycle, and now we're having to use it a lot less and a lot less frequently than we were previously. But certainly in years 4 and 5, those crops will just be receiving compost. There won't be any other amendments, but in the first 3 years, we will be putting in some high potassium fertiliser for the tomatoes and some high nitrogen fertiliser for the cucumbers. Just a few pictures to relieve the slideshow. We've got some tomatoes growing here in May 2011, just not long after they've been planted. At the same time, the courgettes there being picked by this stage, and at the same time as these areas are kind of coming into production, we're harvesting kale, red chard, salad leaves, and you can see in the background some French beans. And so the advantage of the protected cropping system, the mixed cropping system, in that when areas are being taken up with one thing, there's a lot of yield coming off something else, and hopefully gives sort of some idea of the health of the crops as well. Always looks good on a sunny day. In terms of green manures, what we've done is I have spoken about our green manure system before in more detail, so it'll be a bit of a quick rundown of it. But we're using a mixture of sweet and crimson clover, which is sown during May. This allows us to actually crop right up to May, which is filling some of that hungry gap time when produce is at a premium. And then as those crops are coming out, we're sowing clover. And that'll be 1 year in 5, as you saw in the rotation. The advantage of this is that at a time when potentially we can produce a lot of stuff, because we don't really aim to wholesale that much, we've got a fairly steady market. We don't want to peak in our production too much, so this is actually a better time for us to put green manure in, rather than in the winter, when our glasshouse protected space is at a premium for us when we were trying to produce lots of crops for our customers to keep them going through the winter. And it keeps the demand steady. It reduces our labour requirement a little bit, and it also means that the clovers are really going for it. I mean, as long as they're inoculated with the correct nitrifying bacteria, that they get incredibly rapid growth and good nodulization on the roots, which says to us that we are actually fixing a decent amount of nitrogen in that soil for the following crops. The drawbacks for doing it this time of year is that we do have to water the stuff and we do have to weed it. It might sound a bit crazy, but we've actually come up with a way of doing this which seems to work quite well. There's me using a Glazer wheel hoe, courtesy of Samuel Eglinton, to weed through the clover crops. And that's at the sort of fairly initial leaf stage. It's a fairly quick operation, does a really good job, and because of the control over the irrigation, we can allow it then to dry out, and it achieves quite a clean clover crop. You can see the tomatoes next door, so this is going in a little bit later than May. This is probably more like in June. We obviously can alter the way we do things a little bit depending on the season, and this year everything was much later because of a very slow spring. And actually, luckily, we've had quite a mild autumn, which has meant that we've managed to, the whole season's kind of been moved on a chunk. There's the bulking up a little bit there, a mixture of sweet and crimson clover, and then around about this is a particularly good one. Doesn't always come out this good, but obviously as we get better and better at doing it, we're hoping that we will achieve this sort of growth. We're looking at about 1 metre of growth of the sweet clover before it's cut in. Unfortunately, I don't have a picture of the nodulization of the roots. And unfortunately, at the time of year when things look most interesting, we're so busy that we don't get a chance to take any pictures. All my pictures of a winter of crops when I'm wandering around with the camera thinking, I should take more pictures in the summer. The other sort of part of the triangle of good soil management, obviously composting. To date, we're using a bay system, and after hearing Michael talk last year, I spoke to him about it. We're installing a forced aeration bay for our compost. We've never really liked the idea of going down the windrow composting situation, not just because you need a lot of feedstock to justify the machinery costs, but also because of the lack of worms that although you have a maturation stage, the way that we compost is quite gentle. Although everything gets turned and aerated, it's a gentler way, and we find that we get a lot of worms in the compost, which in our protected cropping system is very important because we don't have a huge amount of worms in the soil in the glass houses. We're using wood chip from a local tree surgeon who's we've got a good relationship with. It just gets dropped off for free, and we allow that to compost for a few months to sit there and mature a little bit. It gets a lot of fungal mycelium growing through it, and it gets up to a bit of temperature, and it breaks down a little bit before it then goes in to be mixed with the vegetable waste for composting. And we also try to make sure that he knows that we like the finer wood chip. We don't want too many big chunks in there, which is lucky because a lot of his customers like the big chunks for mulching their rose beds and things, and so we take all the sort of finer, often the stuff that he gets in the summer. We'd hope that a forced aeration system would be more efficient on fuel because we're just running a blower to force the air through rather than running the diesel front loader to mix the compost. And we also have started, rather than thinking about putting the amendments where we identify deficiencies into the soil, we're putting them into the compost. So where magnesium is perhaps a problem, that we can add kieserite to the composting system rather than putting it direct into the soil, where it potentially does have some effect on soil life, restricting the growth of soil life before it gets incorporated into the kind of soil matrix. And pretty much every crop, unless we're direct sowing, we find the compost can inhibit the kind of direct sowing machine a little bit with the lumps, but almost every crop will receive compost before it goes in. And hungry crops will have top dressings through the season. Things like cucumbers and tomatoes will add extra compost to the top. And there's the old bays. We now have some new bays which are completely covered. These ones we just had covered with plastic to prevent leaching. But we now have created an entirely new system that is going to have 8 bays, and hopefully one of those by this time next year will have a forced aeration system in it. And then we've also looked at how we till the soil. I mean, my ideal would be a no-dig system, but on a commercial scale this is pretty unworkable. So on 1.5 acres, what we've found is that after having used a pedestrian rotavator, the spading machine, for some time, we've actually modified a power harrow so that we're only cultivating about 3 inches deep. And there's a picture of it. We've got some subsoiling tines that run behind the wheelings so that the compaction of the wheels is broken up, and then the roller on the back can be set to the depth required, depending on whether we're planting pots, which will obviously need to go a bit deeper, or just blocks. And we're just really cultivating to make it easy to plant into. The soil itself is quite good and probably would respond fairly well to a no-dig system. We have tried no-dig on certain beds and found that the crops grew fairly well, but the practicalities of managing that system in terms of weeding out perennial weeds, incorporating compost, growing green manures, things like that, just made it very labour intensive. So it's kind of like almost a bed former, but just tilling very shallowly on the surface.
Does that incorporate the compost?
Yeah, it incorporates the compost quite well. Yeah, it just stirs it all in. So we get this sort of bed after doing this. That's 3 beds being created in a bay. And you can see where the gangways are, and then we'll just scuff over that with a rake just to flatten off those ridges, which leaves the surface quite loose, but the The roller on the back has firmed the soil down quite nicely to make sure we've got good moisture retention in that soil. There's a bed of pak choi grown in a power harrowed bed applied with compost, and you can see that the chap's next door to that clearing an old bed of spinach. This would be around about sort of early April, I expect. So the question really that we can sort of come back round to would be, having looked at the small scale and the large scale systems, is does local food production and improved sustainability for protected crops go hand in hand? And I would say that for us, yes, that is the case. Although I know that Wild Country Organics, Adrian Izzard in Cambridgeshire, operates quite a large mixed cropping system. If any of you have had the Right Swan catalogue through recently, he's featured in there. And it's his system is reliant on quite a lot of fertility inputs. He doesn't use a huge amount of compost because of the size of his operation. But he basically supplies supermarkets, multiples, and Riverford and Abel and Cole and people. So mixed cropping doesn't necessarily have to go hand in hand with local production. Blaine Camel are a good example of a large protected cropping system that relies on their own homemade compost, which I'm sure they've got better and better at making over the years. And I went to visit. I actually just stole into their... I'm trying to catch Peter's eye and he's not looking at me. Stole into their polytunnels as our family were in Wales, and my wife and child wouldn't let me go and talk to them because they said you'll just be there for hours and it'll get really boring for us. So we went and had a look, but we're really impressed with what they're doing there. And Growing with Grace up north are doing a lot with sort of low tillage, no dig systems, using a lot of compost. Quite an interesting rotation that they have. These are all examples of other glass houses and polytunnel setups that are on quite a large scale and are not growing in the conventional sense. Can the specialist monocrop systems rely purely on compost for their monocropped tomatoes? They're quite cagey about the information that they'll give out because when you get to that sort of size, your market is very fragile, and you don't really want people knowing your trade secrets. But in my experience, tomatoes require a lot of potassium and nitrogen. Not a lot, not necessarily more than compost can provide, but if you're going to grow them every year, there's going to be quite a build-up of phosphate and perhaps calcium in that soil. That's going to need to be addressed with perhaps some more tailored amendments. I'm not sure how they're going about doing that, but I'd be interested to know. Obviously, by varying the crop in a mixed cropping situation, you can put a lot of compost down for your tomatoes, and then following those tomatoes, you can grow other crops which are going to balance out the sort of nutrient status of the soil. But as a final observation, it's not just about soil management, it's also about addressing the efficiency, the waste and the consumer habits, as well as our crop yield. And I think a lot of people working on this get very obsessed with crop yield and are not really looking at the system beyond. And by having a local market, that's much easier to be flexible around the crops you're growing, and make much more efficient use, really, of the space. There's a picture of some various crops, sweet peas in the background, and a very proud-looking John looking at our red Florence onions. Thank you.
Thank you, Pete.